Gonzaga's opening game in the battle for Atlantis will be against West Virginia. And folks, the bracket is set up nicely to give the fans exactly what they want. A championship battle between Mark Few and Tommy Lloyd.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Gonzaga opens the battle for Atlantis against West Virginia. We're going to talk about this Mountaineers team, new coach, new players, all sorts of excitement going on in Morgantown. Plus, a look at the rest of the bracket and the likelihood that we're going to get what we've been wanting for about 3 or 4 years now. Mark Few, Tommy Lloyd, Gonzaga, Arizona. The bracket is set up nicely to give us that as the championship. Doesn't mean both teams will get there. We'll talk about the path for either squad to set us up for that championship battle. We're also going to close the show talking about Kingston Flemings, a 5-star guard in the 2025 class who has listed Gonzaga in his top 5. What does it mean for Flemings? What does it mean for Gonzaga? What does it mean for Isiah Harwell? We'll get to all that to close out the show. We've been waiting for a while. We knew the Battle for Atlantis matchups were coming out soon. They came out almost exactly around this time last year. So we've been kind of sitting around waiting. When is this going to happen? When are we going to be able to talk about this? And we finally got the matchups released on Wednesday morning, a couple hours before I hit the record button here. Gonzaga will open against West Virginia. That game will be on November 27th. It will start at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time, 2:30 Eastern time, as all the games are. It'll be on Paradise Island in the Bahamas for the Battle for Atlantis. It's going to be on either ESPN or ESPN2, not determined at this point, but if you have an ESPN package, you should be able to watch that game. Gonzaga's second game will either be against Indiana or Louisville, depending on who wins either of these games. That game, of course, will be on November 28th. The championship game will take place on November 29th. 3 games, 3 days. That's how it typically goes with those MTEs. The other side of the bracket, Arizona will play Davidson and Oklahoma will play Providence. We're going to talk more about those games later in the show, but right now I want to focus on Gonzaga's first game. Because, yes, the obvious talking point with this tournament is whether we're going to get that Gonzaga-Arizona championship the first time Few and Lloyd will face each other as opponents after Lloyd worked for 20 years under Mark Few on that Gonzaga staff. That's the big storyline. That's the big hope. But in order to get there, Gonzaga's got to take care of business. They got to win 2 games in 2 days before they even can think about potentially facing Tommy Lloyd and the Wildcats. And that first game, it's going to be against the Mountaineers. Gonzaga has never lost to West Virginia. They are 5-0 all time against this West Virginia team, mostly against Bob Huggins, a coach who has been one of the few coaches in that conference in particular to publicly say that he doesn't think Gonzaga would have that much success in the Big 12, yet he is winless against the Zags. We can poke fun at Bob Huggins all we want. He's not the coach anymore after a series of let's just use the word gaffes to describe what happened to Bob Huggins. That's really downplaying it, but it's only a 30-minute show, so we're not going to get all the way into Bob Huggins' transgressions. Safe to say he is no longer the head coach of the West Virginia Mountaineers. Last year, Josh Ehlert took over the program on an interim basis, and things did not go well. This was not Josh Ehlert's fault. He was dismissed after the season. He's now an associate head coach at Utah for what it is worth. The team went 9-23 last year. They went 4-14 in conference play. It was a rough year in Morgantown, but a lot of that stemmed from the amount of departures that the program had because of Huggins' firing. They lost a ton of key players very late in the offseason, had a difficult time replacing many of those players. And then the players that they did bring in, they bring in Raquan Battle, but he's not eligible until partway through the season because of the 2-time transfer rule. Same with Noah Farrakhan. They bring in Kerr Kriisa, but he gets suspended for 10 games. They bring in Jesse Edwards from Syracuse, but he misses about a month with a foot injury. Jose Perez departs the program right before the season starts. They were expecting big things from him. Anything that could have gone wrong for West Virginia last year did. And they did a hard reset at the end of the year. They did not retain Coach Ehlert, like we said. All those players that we just mentioned are gone, every single one of them. And they brought in a bunch of new talent, starting with their new head coach, Darian DeVries. DeVries was the head coach at Drake for the last 6 years. And in those 6 years in the Missouri Valley Conference, DeVries went a whopping 150-55. Basically won 3 times as many games as he lost and not in a small amount of time either, over 6 years. In fact, DeVries won 20 or more games every single year he was the head coach at Drake. He only had more than 10 losses twice in that 6-year stretch of time. He made the NCAA tournament in 3 of the past 4 years. That's really unprecedented in mid-major ranks, period, but especially in a good conference like the Missouri Valley, one of the better mid-major conferences in college hoops, to make the tournament 3 of the past 4 years, to be ranked in the top 25 in 2021. DeVries is no joke. This was a great hire for West Virginia. And when you talk about the coaching carousel this offseason, people focus, of course, on Pat Kelsey going to Louisville. We'll talk about that in a little bit. They focus on, of course, the big, huge moves of John Calipari to Arkansas, Mark Pope to Kentucky, Eric Musselman to USC, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like DeVries to West Virginia doesn't get a ton of attention. But it should, because this is the man who has successfully won every single season he's been a Division I basketball coach. He's never won less than 20 games in a single season. That's pretty impressive. He also brings his son along with him, not as an assistant coach. His son is a player, played for Drake last year, the last 3 years, in fact, and is now going to take his next year, and I believe his final year of eligibility with West Virginia. That is Tucker DeVries. DeVries is 6'7" wing, and folks, he's not just on the roster because of his last name. This is not a Joe Few situation or an Andrew Hurley situation at UConn. Tucker DeVries was twice named Missouri Valley Conference Player of the Year. Last year, he averaged 21.6 points per game, 6.7 rebounds, 3.7 assists, and 1.6 steals. He is a high-volume three-point shooter, 36% last year on over 7 attempts per game. The big question for West Virginia is how his skill set will translate from the Missouri Valley Conference, again, a good mid-major conference, moving into the Big 12, which is a very, very good conference. Perhaps not as deep as it's been in the past, but it's really top-heavy, incredibly talented. That is a tough transition. That's the big story for this team. But DeVries is not the only player on the roster. And of course, the coach is not the only factor for this West Virginia team. They added a ton of other talent in the portal as well. Sincere Harris and Amani Hansberry both come over from a very good Illinois team in the transfer portal. Javon Small was one of the better small guards in the Big 12 last year. He comes over from Oklahoma State. They get Toby Akani from UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago. The Zags actually looked at Akani quite a bit during the early part of the transfer portal season, so somebody that they had on their radar. They also get Joseph Yusufu from Washington State, handful of others as well. This is a fun, rebuilding team. Having said all of this, I don't think West Virginia is going to be all that good this upcoming season. And while I don't want to just dismiss them as an opponent for Gonzaga, the bracket was set. Arizona and Gonzaga are the two best teams in the field. And so as such, we expected them to be put on opposite sides and potentially lined up for a championship. And that is kind of the read that we have on this bracket. I would argue that West Virginia, there's seven of the 8 teams here are power conference teams. I would argue, or 6 of the 8, I guess Gonzaga is not, but I would argue that West Virginia is probably the weakest of that group. And it makes sense that since Arizona drew Davidson, the one non-power team outside of Gonzaga, kind of makes sense that Gonzaga drew West Virginia. I think they're the team that is kind of the most logical team to be Gonzaga's first round opponent. So I think that they should take care of business in this game. They have the continuity advantage, whereas West Virginia, a lot of new faces, a lot of new players, all learning to play with each other. They'll have only played probably 4 or 5 games before they get to the Atlantis tournament. So I don't think this West Virginia team is going to be, they're certainly not going to be as bad as they were last year. They should win 10 or more games. They should win more than 4 games in the Big 12. But I do think that the other teams in this bracket would probably present more of a challenge for Gonzaga in the first round, but that's what you want. You want to be put in a position where you're kind of considered one of the higher seeds in the tournament so that you have a better path to get to the championship. So let's talk about what that path looks like, because either Louisville or Indiana is a pretty exciting second game. And we are going to talk about what that looks like, but we also all know what we really want. We know what we want to see. We know what matchup we're hoping to see on November 29th. And we're going to talk about what that might look like as well all coming up in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about game time, because going to live events, folks, it is the best. Whether it's sports, music, theater, comedy, all of that. And now college sports are just about back. And I'm so glad that I've used game time in the past for sporting events as well as for theater events. We went to a play this summer, one of our first major outings with without our daughter. Very exciting event, very exciting play. Always good to use game time to be able to do that kind of stuff. And I'm looking forward to making new memories this college sports season. And the best news is when you're getting tickets for this upcoming season, Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out all the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste your time searching through thousands of different tickets. So you can take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, folks, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is also brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Usually we're filling you in on a boost or a bonus offer from FanDuel. Well, we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. And if you're looking for something to bet on FanDuel, how about some title odds for the teams that are in the battle for Atlantis? The Zags are the front runner out of those 8 teams at plus 2,000. Unsurprisingly, Arizona's next at plus 3,000, followed by Indiana at plus 5,500, and Pat Kelsey and that new look Louisville team, at plus 8,000. If you want those odds or anything else on FanDuel, just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still talking about the battle for Atlantis Field. We talked about West Virginia in the first segment, Gonzaga's opening opponent, what that matchup might look like. We'll, of course, have more information when we're right up to that event. We'll have some recaps on West Virginia's first 4 or 5 games, how they're looking, what that situation shakes out to be. For right now, though, we're just giving you a little bit of a preview of the team as we see them right now. But I want to move on and talk about Gonzaga's second round game. It will either be Indiana or Louisville, obviously, depending on who wins that game, as well as who wins the West Virginia-Gonzaga game. Gonzaga's got to beat West Virginia. If they do that, they play the winner of Indiana-Louisville. I want to talk about both these teams separately. They're both in different situations, but sort of similar situations in the sense that they're kind of these pseudo blue blood programs. Some places will call them blue bloods. Some places are not going to call them blue bloods, but neither team has been all that competitive recently. It's been about 7 or 8 years since either of these teams were particularly like, oh, that's a team that's going to be a top 5 seed that's going to genuinely compete for a Sweet 16, Elite 8 type of run. Like, neither of these teams have been in that conversation for not in this decade and not most of last decade either. Louisville's been awful the last couple of years, just horrendously bad. They fired Kenny Payne, much needed move. They hired Pat Kelsey, who had 30-win seasons at Charleston, plays this up-tempo style of basketball, and completely overhauled the roster. Completely overhauled. And they had a lot of success in the transfer portal. I think the NIL boosters said, we want to throw a lot of money at Kelsey in Louisville because we want to get this thing right back on track as soon as we can. They had Chucky Hepburn from Wisconsin, a 3-year starting point guard in the Big Ten. They had Javon Hadley from Colorado, Corin Johnson from Washington, Terrence Edward from James Madison. He averaged 17 a game last year. Kason Pryor was a revolution as a stretch 4, stretch 5 for South Florida last year. They had Noah Waterman from BYU. That's just some of their additions. They got plenty more guys. A few guys followed Coach Kelsey from Charleston, who are expected to be big-time contributors for them. This is a very unique team. I think they're going to be good. And by good, I mean like they might contend for a top 5 spot in the ACC. They might contend for an at-large bid. Maybe at times they can go on a hot enough streak to be in the consideration for a top 25 team. They're going to be good. I think Indiana's going to be pretty good too. I'm more concerned about Indiana's roster construction, partly because Louisville's roster construction is just, it's hard to even know what it's all going to look like because every player is new on this roster. Kelsey's a new coach. It's all going to be kind of a different vibe and feel, but I think he did a good job of bringing in players that fit his system. Where I'm more concerned for Indiana, I think Mike Woodson did the same thing. I'm just not sure his system is kind of built for the modern era, if we're going to be completely honest. Indiana added a ton of talent in the transfer portal. They bring in Oumar Ballo. That's the big one, not only for just in general, but also for Gonzaga fans specifically, opportunity on the path to playing Arizona to play Oumar Ballo, who played for both Arizona and Gonzaga during his career. Just kind of fun serendipity moment that we might end up getting in this tournament. Oumar Ballo is the biggest addition for them, the 7-foot center. They also had Miles Rice from Washington State. They also had Kenan Carlisle from Stanford. Those are the three big additions for Mike Woodson and the Hoosiers in the transfer portal. They had some other guys as well. Luke Goody's a good outside shooter, floor spacer for them, but that's kind of the problem. This team does not have nearly enough outside shooting. I think it's fair to expect that a starting five, or at least five guys who are going to play big minutes for this team, are Oumar Ballo, Malik Renault, who's a returning power forward for them, Mackenzie Mbako, who's a sophomore, who many expected to be a one-and-done guy, but he didn't really play all that well last year. As a freshman, Miles Rice and Kenan Carlisle. If that's your starting five right there, almost none of those guys are great three-point shooters. So you have a roster that is just not built to be that floor spacing, three-point shooting type of system that has been so popular across the NBA and college basketball, really for in the NBA for a decade or so, and college basketball more like 5 or 6 years. But I'm not sure how this roster is going to work, how the pieces are going to fit together for Woodson. There's a lot of attention of like Indiana's a top 20 team, top 25 team. This is the year that they're going to win the Big Ten or compete at the top of the Big Ten. And I kind of think they have to in order for Woodson to keep his job. Indiana fans don't put up with mediocrity very much, but I'm not sure I see this roster having the skills and the construction to be at the level that they want it to be. Having said all of that, I think Indiana is going to be favored in this game against Louisville. I think that sets up a Gonzaga-Indiana second-round game. It sets up a reunion with Oumar Ballo, which is fun. It sets up a Eastern Washington reunion of sorts with Miles Rice, who, of course, played at Washington State for the last couple of years. It gives Gonzaga a chance to play a Big Ten team, which is always fun. So I'm hopeful. Either matchup, I think, is fun. Louisville's very fun, too, just because of how new this roster is. I think they're going to play a fast-paced, high-tempo offense, so I think that game will be like a whole bunch of points scored. And I think Gonzaga is certainly going to be favored either against Indiana or Louisville. I think there's very little doubt in my mind that Gonzaga will be the favorite in that situation. And on the other side of the bracket, you got Oklahoma versus Providence. Very kind of unique matchup there. Two teams that just missed the NCAA tournament last year as at-large bids. They're going to be both IDing this game as a potential matchup for them to put on their non-conference resume and kind of help potentially propel them into the NCAA tournament this year. Young coaches, Porter Moser's entering his fourth year with Oklahoma after being at Loyola Chicago. Kim English enters his second season at Providence after being at George Mason previously. I think both these teams are going to be bubble-ish teams again this year. So I think, again, they're both really looking to pick up a potential win here. And then an opportunity to play Arizona, who's very likely going to beat Davidson. That would be quite an upset. Davidson I think they lost 6 players in the portal. They only added 1 player in the portal. They got some freshmen coming in. Davidson's just not where they've been in the past. They're still a quality A-10 team. They're still decent, but I don't think they're going to step up at the level that we've seen from them in the past, and certainly would struggle against a bigger, physical, more stronger Arizona team. But if things shake out the way we think they're capable of, then we get the matchup that we've been wanting for 4 years. We get Gonzaga versus Arizona, Mark Few versus Tommy Lloyd. We're at the point now where there's not as much as many players who are closely connected to both programs. Rem Bakamis still works at Arizona. Shemek Karnowski still works at Arizona. So there are still some connections there. But Oumar Ballo is out the door. Matty Lang, who transferred to Arizona as a walk-on, he is out the door as well. So there's not any players that are kind of mashing up. Obviously, these two teams have recruited similar players in the past. Carter Bryant is going to be an incoming freshman at Arizona. He's a guy that I know Gonzaga was heavily pursuing in the transfer portal. So it'll be interesting to see some of the dynamics of this game. But if this is what we get, I mean, how spoiled are we, right? What an incredible game. I mean, not even just us as Gonzaga fans, everybody. This is a great college basketball game. We talked about the opportunity to potentially play Louisville in a fast-paced team. If Gonzaga plays Arizona in the championship, I don't know what FanDuel is going to set the over-under for total points at, but if it's like 180, which is 90 points per team, I'm hitting the over. I think it's going to be like a 98-92 game. Like, these two teams are going to score in bunches. It's going to be so fun to watch. Again, got to get there. Gonzaga's got to get there. Arizona's got to get there. Both Providence and Oklahoma are decent teams. There's no guarantee Arizona beats either of them. Indiana and Louisville, decent teams. No guarantee Gonzaga beats them. They cannot look ahead. They cannot look ahead and think we just got to get through this game to get to the Arizona game and be focused on that. You got to keep your head on straight. Few is as good as anybody in college basketball at keeping his teams focused on the task at hand. He will not talk about this game in the media at all. I guarantee you reporters, and I'm not blaming them, but they will ask him about the potential for a matchup against Tommy Lloyd. And unless it is confirmed that game is happening, unless it is pre-game, he will not talk about it. I guarantee you. But it's on his mind. How could it not be? He's probably thinking about it right now as I'm recording the show. But I don't think he's going to talk about it. He's going to keep the team focused on the task at hand. But boy, howdy, we're going to be in for an absolute treat on November 29th if things play out the way we expect them to. Folks, closing out the show today, switching over to recruiting topic. Kingston Flemings officially lists Gonzaga in his top 5 ahead of his visit in October for Kraziness in the Kennel. Could he be Gonzaga's future starting point guard? We got more on that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about Ibotta. The summer is almost over, and lots of folks are taking that dream end of the summer vacation, but they're dreading the cost. With Ibotta, though, you can get cash back on every single one of your purchases, so you can spend more time making memories this summer and less time dreaming about it. Ibotta is a free app that lets you earn cash back every single time you shop. You can earn on hundreds of items from groceries to beauty supplies, even kids' toys. So you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter what you're purchasing. The average Ibotta user earns $256 per year. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip, that flight you've been eyeing, or the fancy dinner that you and your friends have been craving. It's time you join the over 50 million users who use Ibotta to earn cash back every time they shop. Right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just for trying the app by using the code LOCKEDONCollege when you register. Just go to the App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Ibotta app to start earning cash back and use code LOCKEDONCollege. That's Ibotta, IBOTTA, on the Google Play or App Store and using the code LOCKEDONCollege. All right, folks, closing out the show, moving over to a conversation on recruiting. And we talked about Kingston Flemings very recently on the podcast, and we've talked about him in connection to Isiah Harwell. And we're going to kind of relitigate that conversation a little bit because we did get an update on the situation. Flemings, 6'3" guard from San Antonio. We'll talk more about who he is, but he has revealed his top 5 list, and Gonzaga is on the list. The top 5 right now: Gonzaga, Houston, Texas, Texas Tech, and Arkansas. So the Zags are in a recruiting battle with 3 in-state schools, including UT Austin, which is the closest school to San Antonio, where Flemings is from, outside of UT San Antonio. But no disrespect, he's not going to go there. So he's looking at basically the closest major program in Texas, 2 other in-state schools in Houston and Texas Tech, and John Calipari. That's who Gonzaga and Mark Few are competing against right now. John Calipari, 3 in-state schools. You know, when you're at the level Gonzaga is, when you start playing with the big boys, this is the kind of recruiting battles that you find yourself in. On 3, as they always do, they have their kind of projection by percentages. You know, there's an X% chance player's going to go here, X% they're going to go here. I've talked about these fairly regularly on the show. I also acknowledge to not always take them too seriously. And this one was particularly humorous because there's not a consensus by any stretch. Texas is in the lead with 29.7%. Houston's next at 25.9%. Tech is next at 16.8%. Gonzaga is 14%. Arkansas was not even on the list, which all this tells me is that they don't know. They don't know. It's pretty wide open recruiting right now. Gonzaga getting in the mix somewhat late in the process. We suddenly found out that they were hosting him for Kraziness in the Kennel. Now we find out they're on his top 5. He has not been to campus. He has not really openly talked about Gonzaga. So it was kind of here's a player Gonzaga's interested in. And I think it's important to think about the context here. And based on kind of reading the tea leaves and some conversations I've had with some folks, it sounds like some of what is happening with Kingston Flemings on both sides, Gonzaga side and Fleming side, probably has a lot to do with another Gonzaga target, Isiah Harwell. We talked about this on a show earlier this week. Isiah Harwell has been a long-time target of Gonzaga as a top 10 prospect in the 2025 class from Pocatello, Idaho. Again, been connected to Gonzaga for a long time, played high school basketball at the Wasatch Academy where Nolan Hickman played. He is a strong Houston lean. That was unexpected. He had been kind of a Gonzaga was expected to be the front runner for a long time, was the front runner for a long time. He took a visit to Cal, and Cal kind of climbed into the conversation, in part because there's an assistant coach on Cal's staff who is close connection to the Harwell family. But then all of a sudden, Houston comes into the conversation. On3 is now giving them 86% chance, which again, don't always take them super seriously, but when it's that high, and we know that Harwell is planning to commit on September 12th, less than a month away, that's certainly notable. And I think the fact that Harwell suddenly becomes a big lean for Houston right around the time that Gonzaga starts pursuing, or at least it becomes known that Gonzaga is pursuing Kingston Flemings, it's not a coincidence. Let's put it that way. Because again, if Harwell does go to Houston, not only does that mean Gonzaga is, continues to be on the market for another guard. They already have Davis Vogel coming in 2025. Of course, they have Braden Smith, who's going to, he's only a 2-year player, but he's going to be a first-year player for Gonzaga in 25-26. So they have a starting point guard in Braden Smith. They have Davis Vogel in the mix as a true freshman, but they were looking for more guard depth in that class. And if Harwell is suddenly a Houston lean and Gonzaga is suddenly pursuing Kingston Flemings, it feels like they pivoted. I don't know. It's kind of a chicken and the egg. I don't know what happened first, whether Gonzaga was like, hey, we've been recruiting you for a long time. We haven't heard anything. If you're not coming here, we're going to start looking in another direction. Or if Harwell said that he was kind of thinking Houston, leaning that direction, and Gonzaga said, okay, well, we need to find somebody else. I don't know exactly what happened, what conversations have happened, haven't happened, are going to happen, any of that specifics. But the fact that Flemings is also being pursued by Houston, again, not a coincidence. On3, which doesn't always update these percentages, still has Houston as a 26% chance. How far does that drop when they land Harwell, if that happens? If on September 12th, Harwell commits to Houston, are they still going to pursue Kingston Flemings? I'm not saying they won't. Harwell's a little bit more of a combo guard, off-ball guard. Flemings is a pure facilitating point guard. He is a pass-first point guard. So they can absolutely coexist. But from a NIL perspective, from a scholarship count perspective, again, I haven't done a huge deep dive in Houston's present and future recruiting necessarily. But again, I think that looking at the situation from kind of a bird's eye view, you can sort of see how maybe this has happened. And Fleming's going to come to Gonzaga October 5th. Kraziness in the Kennel. He's going to be in the house. Again, Gonzaga's in a tight race with one of the best recruiters in the entire generation, and John Calipari, in 3 in-state programs. So it's not going to be an easy recruiting battle. Gonzaga's got to sell it. They got to sell it at Kraziness. That place has got to be popping. They got to be cheering for him. He's got to have an absolute blast. Like it's got to be a big time sell to land this kid, and it's worth it because this kid's really good. 21st ranked player according to On3's industry rankings, 13th at On3 in the 2025 class, 22nd at 247, 23rd at ESPN, 27th at Rivals. So there's a fair amount of consensus here among him as a clear top 30 prospect. Most places have him top 25. He's kind of right in that conversation in the top 20 as well. He's a great lead guard. Reading the recruiting stuff on him, he sounds exactly like a Nembhard. He's great at throwing ahead. He's great at out in tempo. He's great at making those throw ahead passes. He looks to pass first. He's a facilitator. His feel for the game is really high. He loves being out in transition. He's a table setter. He has according to Brandon Jenkins, the writer at 247 Sports, he has the highest ceiling of any lead guard in the 2025 class. He is a prototypical Gonzaga type point guard. So not a surprise that they're going after him. Again, don't know that Harwell's for sure going to Houston, despite the fact that that is the overwhelming consensus right now among recruiters. Don't know that Harwell leaning Houston is necessarily in direct response to Gonzaga pursuing Flemings, or if Gonzaga's pursuing Flemings in response to Harwell, or if maybe they're not as connected as I think that they are. But it's kind of hard to imagine they're not at some level connected to each other, this kind of recruiting battle that's happening with Houston and Gonzaga and Flemings and Harwell. We'll keep you up to date. Obviously, as we know more, we got 3 weeks till Harwell makes his announcement. Nick Kamenia has also listed Gonzaga in his top 5. No date set for his announcement as well, but those are 3, I should say, really big-time recruiting battles that Gonzaga's in right now. It's been a phenomenal summer for Mark Few and the Zags on the transfer portal additions, recruiting, winning a gold medal, all sorts of great stuff going on for Few and the Zags. We'll see if they can close out the summer and into the fall with some big wins here on the recruiting trail. It's going to wrap it up for me today and for this week here in the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We'll be back next week getting you up to date on any additional recruiting updates we see. We'll do a mailbag as we always do on that Monday. All sorts of other fun stuff coming your way in the coming weeks as well, getting some fun guests lined up for y'all. Thanks again for listening, folks. Have a fantastic rest of your week and weekend. And until next time, as always, go Zags.